In December 2011, Farming Smarter held its annual conference and trade show at the Lethbridge Lodge Hotel, bringing together over 250 agricultural professionals and over 20 speakers. The conference served to educate members of the farming community on growing trends, opportunities, and issues facing today's agricultural industry. We now take you to the Farming Smarter conference to view the presentation of our speakers.
This morning at the Winter Cereal Producers Commission meeting, Jack Swainson said you had to be 100 miles away from home to be an expert. And being from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, I guess that good news, I'm an expert. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you today about something that some of you may think about occasionally and some of you may not think about at all. And that's what role wetlands can play on your farm. And I'll start off by maybe giving you a little bit of background about Ducks Unlimited, why we work with the agriculture industry, and that sort of thing. So DU, our mission statement, and yesterday our one presenter said that it was important to have a mission statement that everyone understood well, and ours is that we're a private, not-for-profit conservation association that conserves, restores, and manages wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl, and that these habitats also benefit wildlife and other people. Well, we work for a company that's run by biologists that discovered that they needed to hire some engineers to build some stuff, and then they had to hire Aggies to make sense of what they said and to get some work done. And I think most of you probably get what wetlands, wetlands are a pretty straightforward thing. And one thing that I learned from working with our biologists is that ducks are not like Kool-Aid. You don't just add water and stir. And that associated habitats are what most of us would identify as a hayfield, a pasture, a winter wheat field, a canola field, and other fields out there. And ducks come back to the prairies every year to breed and raise their young. And those associated habitats are the nesting cover that they use. And ducks will actually travel up to a mile away from water to nest. So that's why DU is involved with the agriculture industry, because really the ag industry manages and owns almost all the habitat that they use. So DU was started during the 1930s as a response to plummeting waterfowl numbers as a result of the Great Depression. And not surprisingly, our early projects focused on putting water back on the prairies with a goal of drought-proofing the prairies. Well, I don't think that we quite succeeded on that front. But as we did more research, or as our biologists did more research, one of the things that they discovered was that the limiting factor wasn't necessarily big wetlands where you see lots of ducks in the spring and fall, which are for staging. It was those little tiny wetlands that are an acre or less and safe places for them to nest in the associated habitats. So this is a map showing where Ducks Unlimited offices are across Canada, and you'll see that we're pretty much everywhere within the country, and a real clustering in the agricultural areas, particularly the prairies. And everyone with an agricultural background says, well, the prairies are the breadbasket of the world. That was what we billed ourselves for the longest time. And it's also worth noting that we're also the duck basket of the world. And that means that continentally, about 70% of the continental waterfowl population breed on the Canadian prairies and the northern Great Plains like the Dakotas. So it's only logical that DU would work with the other people on the landscape that manage it and own it. And another partnership that's worth noting is developing one in the boreal forest, where we work with the forestry industry and the oil and gas industry to meet some of their needs, as well as meeting waterfowl habitat needs. So on to the topic that I was supposed to talk about, wetlands as an asset on the farm. When most of us think about farm assets, we think about land, which Kevin talked a fair bit about yesterday during his presentation. We talk about labor, and we talk about capital. And those are kind of the typical assets that we would think about. The topic I have to talk about today is the natural capital assets. And some of you may have heard the term ecological goods and services. Some of you may not, but that's really the non-commodity things that come off of the landscape that are becoming, as society becomes less involved with the rural landscape, it becomes more interested in what those are, if that makes any sense at all. So some of the natural capital assets that we experience on our farm are insects. Sometimes they're a liability and are viewed as a pest, but often insects are viewed as a a positive. Certainly bees as pollinators are well known to be an asset to the ag industry. This picture is of a parasitic wasp, which helps control orange blossom wheat midge. Other natural capital assets include wetlands, bush, trees, and that sort of thing. And I know driving from Moose Jaw to Lethbridge, the tree or two along the way were a pleasant distraction from the prairie. And certainly when winds get up to 100K and that sort of thing, we certainly do appreciate them on the landscape. And last, and certainly not least, and probably predictably in the presentation, is water, which is extremely vital to all life on Earth. And I don't need to tell someone from southern Alberta that water can be an extremely short supply. And the experiences in Russia and Australia and more recently in Texas certainly illustrate how dependent we are on timely rainfall. But over the last couple of years, we've also learned that water can be extremely abundant. And yes, you can have too much of a good thing. So wetlands are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, and home to over 600 species. And despite this importance, they still continue to be lost at a very high rate. Recent research has shown that we lose about 80 acres of wetland per day in Canada. And analysis that we did in the east central part of Saskatchewan, which was funded by Royal Bank and BHP Billiton, showed that in the last 10 years, about a third of the wetlands that are left have been drained. So while you travel through southern Alberta, you may not see a whole lot of drainage going on because it's a drier environment, but it's certainly something that many parts of the agriculture industry is still very engaged in. And as common as a combine is on some farms, in some areas a scraper is equally common. And wetlands, some of the other values they provide, in the drought of the early 2000s, the presence of surface water was certainly driven home as an important source of water for livestock, for people. And many small communities are still reliant on surface water for their domestic water. And increasingly, partially as a result of stricter regulations on quality, but partially due to increased runoff from drainage activities, we've seen more and more boil water advisories in small communities. And the other value that wetlands provide as an ecological asset is recreation. And bird watching happens to be one of the fastest growing pastimes in North America. And it's certainly something that people eventually are going to be possibly interested in investing in. Most assets that we think about have location, location, and location as an important criteria for their value. And wetlands are certainly fitting into that category. And the other thing that determines value or liability of this asset is what production system you're in. The beef industry has been a long-time partner and has identified the value of wetlands because water is often a very limiting resource and a direct input into a beef operation. And until recently, it was often thought that just the presence of water was good enough, but research done by Wilms and by Lardner has shown that over a 90-day grazing period, providing clean water versus direct access to wetlands can increase weight gain by 9 to 10%, which is not insignificant. So DU has partnered with the livestock industry to help provide clean water for livestock, to exclude cattle from wetlands, which increase their habitat value, and other things that work in both industries' interest. But based on the show of hands that I saw yesterday, I think most people here are annual croppers. And the relationship between annual croppers and wetlands have been less clear. And certainly, provision of irrigation water out of reservoirs, often ones that were built as part of our effort to drought-proof the prairies, is one example where water directly benefits agriculture. But more and more we see that wetlands are also seen as a liability, and the market signals that most landowners have seen have been telling them to drain the wetlands far more efficiently and grow more. And you certainly can't blame people for taking actions that the marketplace signals. So the last thing I would do is stand here and condemn people for making logical decisions over the past, how long have we been here, 100, 110 years, to produce more because that was what the marketplace was telling them to do. And with the prevalence of agriculture on the landscape across the Canadian prairies, scenes like this certainly aren't unusual. This one I think was taken in about 2002 or 2003. And it shows that, you know, people were responding to market stimuli to grow more and to be more efficient with larger equipment. And currently, I think I said earlier, there was about 70% of the wetlands across the prairies have been drained. In some areas, up to 95% have been drained. Dwayne Beck referenced the Red River Valley, which is a highly impacted landscape. So it's not out of context to say that likely the agriculture industry has probably done most of that drainage, because there aren't many large communities in the Red River Valley. And certainly scenes like this are becoming more and more evident as capacity to do drainage work increases. And to date, I was talking about market stimuli driving land use decisions, but as we better understand the implications of drainage on the land, this photo was taken in southern Manitoba this past spring, and it shows the result of the research done by Pomeroy et al. At the University of Saskatchewan, showing that increasing drainage, not surprisingly, also increases downstream flows, both the peak of the flow and the length of the peak of the flow. And as people start to have to deal with the economic consequences of that, probably more and more we need to think about wetland drainage not as developing an asset, but incurring a liability. Ducks Unlimited works in partnership with several industry organizations. One of them is Nutrients for Life, and one of the things that they brought forward to us and asked us, well, can you support the 4Rs? Because that's one of our environmental stewardship efforts. So, of course, 4Rs are using the right source of nitrogen or right source of nutrients at the right rate, in the right place, and at the right time. And we got our science folks together with their science folks, because DU is an organization that puts a high value on science. And we went through the 4Rs, and we concluded that with the exception of placing nutrients in a drained wetland, we fully support the 4Rs of nutrient stewardship, because placing those nutrients in that drained wetland increased their risk of loss. So DU has worked with several of the crop life companies to put forward maybe a different perception on agriculture than what a lot of environmental groups might. We've supported GM agriculture or GM crops. We've supported the use of crop protection products and nutrients, because one of the things that we look at modern agriculture doing is producing more on the existing acreage so that we can keep those small remaining habitat areas intact rather than having to break all of them. I was at the Grow Canada conference last week, and one of the presenters was talking about how many more acres we need to feed an increasing population. And Dwayne Beck, I think, said it very well, that we probably can't afford to degrade our ecosystem so that we can feed someone somewhere else. So looking at the hydrologic response to wetland drainage on the landscape, this is a kind of a neat little cartoon. You see a little stream there with a dark green area, which is what's called the contributing area. So that's the uplands that drain into that stream. So any water that falls on that area runs into the stream and goes downstream. The lighter green area illustrates the contributing area to each of the individual wetlands. And research that we did in Manitoba showed that as you drain each of those individual wetlands into that stream, you increase the contributing area. And the net result of that study was that 31% increase in contributing area resulted in a 34% increase in stream flow. So your stream gets much larger, as that cartoon illustrates. You also move 34% more phosphorus off the landscape, 57% more nitrogen, and 85% more sediment, which says that you are sending a liability downstream. Another thing that Ducks Unlimited has worked with the Crop Life Canada on is buffer zones. How many of you read your labels of your products you purchased last year and are aware of all their buffer zone requirements? I know I can't put my hand up. Most of us can't. And one of the things that is part of the registration of every product is establishing a buffer zone or a setback from water that you have on your property. And a huge amount of science and research goes into establishing that as part of registering the products. But what is kind of concerning is that when it gets to the retail and the farm gate, it's kind of moot. And that's probably not in our long-term best interest either. So one of the things that DU provided to that discussion was some of the buffer strips that were being proposed by PMRA and Health Canada were, in our opinion, ridiculous. and they made it completely impractical to apply the products. You'd basically be in violation of the label when you drove onto the quarter section, which then logically encourages people to get rid of the wetlands that were being protected by the buffer zone requirement, which doesn't make a lot of practical sense. So we did do some work with PMRA, and I think it's ongoing, but I'm hopeful that it eventually bears some fruit. I just pulled out the Saskatchewan Crop Protection Guide just as a point of reference when I was making this presentation up on the weekend, and the point of the message is buffer zones are different for different products. So bringing this around to customers, yesterday we heard about the customer is always right, and the customers becoming more interested in not only the safety of their product and the food value of their product, but also what the environmental consequences of producing that product were. And whether our consumers are well informed or not is really not important. They're making decisions based on the information they have. And I think we have a choice or an opportunity to educate those consumers or to allow them to continue making the decisions that they make. And one effort in that regard that was announced last week at CropLife is a partnership that happened between, it was led by Pulse Canada, the Canola Council of Canada, the Canadian Wheat Board, CropLife Canada, Ducks Unlimited, and General Mills. And that was basically taking the Keystone Indicators from the US, which is basically an intensity measure, and applying it to the crops that are grown in Canada. And what we were able to illustrate out of step one of that is, not surprisingly to anyone in this room, but probably our customers were completely unaware of it, is that we've become far more efficient in energy use, land use, and other areas in producing that commodity, which is a good news story, which we want to tell. We're just in the process of moving along to step two of that, which takes a little broader look at what the overall landscape implications are, and have we gotten better at the landscape level rather than just the acre under production. So if anyone has interest in contributing to that, or if your organizations have any interest, we'd love to hear from you. Shifting gears a little bit towards commodities that can be sold by farmers in other parts of the world. I mentioned ecological goods and services earlier, and two programs that I wanted to mention that's probably some of you have heard about are, one is the European model, where very densely populated part of the world, and farmers have the opportunity to receive payment from government for providing a nice pastoral landscape, which I have family that farms in Denmark, and when they describe what the expectations are, it makes a guy from Moose Jaw kind of shake his head. But for a highly urban society where people are liking to go for a drive in the country, maybe it makes some sense. One that probably makes a little more sense in a Canadian context is the Australian bush tender system, where landowners can bid to provide an ecological good or service, and if they're successful bidders, are then financially rewarded for doing so. The first example on the Canadian prairies that we've seen of farmers being able to sell an ecological good is through carbon sequestration. And right here in Alberta, you guys are far ahead of the curve compared to the other provinces in being able to sell carbon offset credits. And DU's been working in that regard, and despite the fact that Canada has stepped back from the Kyoto commitment, we're hopeful that someday producers will be able to not only sell carbon credits from no-till, but also possibly rewarded for restoring wetlands, which we've been able to prove are also a way to sequester carbon on the landscape. And one thing that right now, thank you, agriculture is an unregulated marketplace, but I think we're moving towards a time where we may have to do full accounting of that. And I thought I would just do a little bit of math for you here. Converting a 2,000 hectare farm from regular till to no-till sequestered about 2,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Draining 6 hectares of wetlands released the same amount of carbon that you would have sequestered in that year. So something just worth bearing in mind. And to sort of bring things towards a wrap up, natural areas are assets. And I think that there's an opportunity with the science that we now have behind us to move forward the value of or the fact of them of being an asset, and we have science to support a lot of that. And when I look back, agriculture is an industry that has a very long-term perspective, I think, because we're stewarding natural resources. And when I look back on our own farm, our original homestead that great-granddad homesteaded in 1904, there's a blow dirt ridge in the trees that's probably taller than I am, which we're not proud of that. But It's a reality of the farm. And it's wrong to look back at great-granddad and granddad and judge them for having soil erosion occur on their farm, because they were working with the best equipment and the best knowledge that they had available in the day. Now, today, there's one farmer in our neighborhood that still does tillage summer fallow, and when his land blows, the rest of us look at that and say, you know, that's not good farming. And I think that that's a judgment that our agriculture industry now passes when we see land blowing. I think that when we look at 70% of the wetlands being drained, in the past, we can't look back and condemn that either, because people were responding to the policies of the day and responding to market stimuli saying to go ahead and do that. With the knowledge that we have now about nutrients moving downstream, about greenhouse gases, I think that as we move forward, we might look at draining wetlands the same way we look at blowing soil as being a bad thing. The last thing I wanted to bring forward was we talked about, or Dwayne Beck talked a little bit about feeding the 9 billion people. And one of the things that Canada has done a good job of is segmenting out the part of the population that can afford to pay for the goods so that we can make a reasonable living, but also pay the freight from somewhere like Canada to all the way around the world. And one thing about customers who pay a high price for a premium product is that they're a little more demanding. And the images you're seeing flashing on the screen there, which were all taken in the last 2 or 3 years, are probably not the production system that they would align with the product that they're buying. So in closing, I hope that at least stimulates some thought and gives a little maybe different perspective on wetlands and their role on your farms. And I think I managed to finish on time. So if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.